Without much ado, we're starting our ADU presentation. Welcome Dina Elkinawy, who is a director at Pacific Crest Consultants. She has amazing experience with building and zoning code. She represented hundreds of projects at public hearings. She was working at the Board of Building and Safety Commissioners at the LADBS. And she was a case manager, backroom plan checker during her career. She has a extended portfolio of projects, not only in Los Angeles, but also in Orange and Ventura counties. And Santa Monica, Pasadena, Rancho Palos Verdes, basically you name it, Southern California. She's a graduate of the University of California, Irvine, in BS in Civil Engineering. She enjoys bike rides and, as we learn, has a sweet rescue dog, Aurora, who is a part of the plan checks. I learned. Welcome, Dina, and the screen is yours. For all, the presentation is recorded and will be available via our AWA+D YouTube channel. We invite everybody to look it up so you don't miss a thing. Thank you, Dina, and you have all the authority to share the screen to your how you like it.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. So I think Chris will be sharing the presentation. Thank you, Magdalena and Chris, for the kind introduction. As they stated, my name is Dina Elkinawy, and I am the Director of Regional Projects for PCC. My background is in civil engineering and plan check. I was with the City of Los Angeles Building and Safety Department for over 6.5 years. I worked in plan check, case management, the commission office, worked closely with the building code and zoning code engineers for code amendments and policy. And so I hope that you'll find the presentation today to be helpful and informative for your clients and if you have a project on your property. So going into our topics for today. So Chris, next slide, please. Thank you. We'll review the background and history of ADUs and JADUs, how they came to be, what were the policies that came to be to allow for these types of units. We'll review what is an accessory dwelling unit and your accessory dwelling unit and their specific parameters and how they're defined. And today we'll focus on the City of Los Angeles. Like Magdalena mentioned, I am the Director of Regional Projects. I work on projects from up north in Oxnard all the way down to Del Mar, San Diego area. So if we end up having additional time during the Q&A, we may be able to touch on other cities beyond City of LA. Next slide, please. So history of ADUs and JADUs, how did that come to be? So due to the housing crisis that we're facing in the state of California, the governor signed laws starting in 2016 to allow for additional housing and density and essentially allowing for additional development rights for property owners in residential areas. Those were amended several times. The latest amendment to look out for took effect this year, January 1st of 2023. With these laws coming from Sacramento to add these additional accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units, they're essentially imposing regulations on cities and local governments to allow this increase in density. And, as we know, and we briefly discussed before the presentation began, there are areas where, there's resistance to development, resistance to construction, adding density, you have contention there. So there were negotiations that took place. The cities didn't immediately say, okay, yeah, we'll add these accessory dwelling units. There was resistance there, and that's how local governments were able to implement ordinances for how they will allow these new types of dwelling units. There's a base state ADU that's allowed in residential uses generally. That will go over, but beyond that, there are city-specific regulations for accessory dwelling units. Next slide, please. So,
I'm sorry, I'm trying. There we go. No, next one. There we go. Okay.
Thank you. So what is an accessory? What is an ADU? What's a JADU? An ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. It's essentially a second dwelling you can have on your property. It's like an independent house. Sorry, apologize one second. The dog we're talking about is making a lot of noise. 1 second.
I'm honestly surprised Aurora's not on this slides, but Dina did not.
I took the bone away. Making a lot of noise. In any case, so the accessory dwelling unit is an independent house you can now have on your property. It would have its own access from the exterior entrance and exit. It would not be connected to the main house. So it can be attached to the main house, but it would be like a duplex, for instance, would have a 1 hour rated wall separation, STC 50 sound separation between the residence and the accessory dwelling unit. You would not have a door connecting it. The idea is that the residents of the ADU would not have to interact or engage with the residents of the main house. It has to have its own kitchen. So this can be a bachelor kitchen, or it could be a full kitchen, which could be beneficial to a property that wants to add an additional kitchen. It needs to have a bathroom. So again, it's an independent house. They have their own kitchen, cooking facilities, their own bathroom facilities. It would have its own address. And like I said, no interior access between the dwelling. It can be attached to the main house and then have that sound a 1 hour rated separation, or it can be an independent building detached from the main residence or the existing building on site. Or it could be a conversion of a permitted garage, for example. A junior ADU is very different from an ADU. That has to be within the existing footprint of the building. So it would have to be within the house already. That being said, you could theoretically apply for an addition to the main house, obtain the certificate of occupancy. So you obtain the permits, build it, call for inspection, obtain a certificate of occupancy, then subsequently come back and apply for a permit for the JADU conversion, for instance. And this would be internal access to, you can have internal access with the JADU to the dwelling. And I'll go into more of the JADU parameters in a future slide. Next slide, please. So how do you determine if an ADU or JADU is right for your client, or what are some considerations we need to make, or for your own property if you're considering adding additional development? It's a major investment. An ADU is, like I said, a house. It's a house with its own amenities, its own access. So the development of that, the cost of that wouldn't vary significantly from a brand new house, adding another house on a lot, for example. The time is not necessarily going to be a faster process for an accessory dwelling unit. The city takes it very seriously when you're adding additional density, you're adding a home, you're going to have occupants, families in that. It's going to have to undergo the agency clearances that you would for a single family, a new single family, for instance. There are local restrictions that would need to be considered as well. There are certain areas that restrict ADUs, and we'll go over the parameters in a future slide regarding that. And you also have regulatory standards. So we have, I'll go over the state ADU and then the city ADU. Once we go into the city ADU, there's going to be city regulatory standards that you're going to have to comply with. And those vary from city to city. It's not consistent. Once we're beyond the state ADU, how they're implementing the policy varies from Santa Monica to Los Angeles to Oxnard and so forth. And how they're, for instance, the Coastal Commission, which I will dive into as well, has restrictions depending on where you are. Chris, you can go to the next slide. So now we can get into the ADU parameters. So what is the state ADU and the local ADU? The state ADU is great. This is really beneficial for a property that, you've reached your maximum RFA, FAR, so residential floor area or floor area ratio, depending on the zone that you're in. If you've reached your maximum, you're looking to add an addition, build more, this is a great option. The 800 square foot ADU would not count towards that floor area so long as it meets these parameters. You zoom in a little bit on. Is there a way to make this a little larger on your end, Chris? Probably not.
I'm sorry, I thought I was actually full screening this. So I apologize. I don't see how I can personally make it bigger.
I was able to enlarge it on my end.
Okay, great.
Perfect, thank you. So as long as we meet these specific parameters. So this is good to note now, this has changed. So for the January 1st, 2023, these are the updated height limits for the state ADU. For a, so 800 square foot, up to 800 square feet, you can now add, it needs to meet the definition of an accessory dwelling unit, but it would be exempt from floor area. So that's, when you're thinking about as an ADU right for you, that's a big benefit that people look for. The height limit for a detached ADU is up to 16 feet. If you are within a half mile of a transit stop, bus stop, then it's 18 feet. If it's a detached accessory dwelling unit and on site you have a multi-story, multi-family building, so, for instance, a 2-story duplex, then the maximum height is also 18 feet. And then the last one is great. So the attached ADU height limit is 25 feet or the height of the zone, the maximum height limit of the zone, whichever is lower. So for instance, if your zone said 30 feet max, then the ADU, attached ADU would be limited to 25 feet. In the event that, it says 23 feet is your height limit for the zone, then it would be a 23-foot height limit for the ADU. The city authorized ADU is when you're going beyond the 800 square feet. Then that does not get exempt from floor area in the city of Los Angeles. This area, you just want to make sure then we go back RFA, floor area ratio, and ensure that you can fit this up to 1,200 square foot accessory dwelling unit. And the height limit for that is 2 stories. And for both, the setbacks are 4 feet for the side and rear yard. Chris, next slide, please. So what is a junior ADU? So I promised to touch on junior ADUs a little bit more. It's Again, within the footprint of the existing building, theoretically we could come in, do an addition, and then once that's complete, apply for a JADU. But it needs to be within the footprint of the building. It can have shared facilities. So unlike the ADU, it can have interior access from the dwelling. It doesn't have to have an independent access. It can share sanitation facility. So bathroom, for example, it doesn't have to have its own bathroom. It doesn't have to have its own kitchen either. It can share those amenities with the dwelling. The benefit to that I've seen it utilized is in multi-residential buildings where we're limited by the number of units. Then adding a JADU could be a good option. I've seen conversions of laundry rooms and rooms of that nature, really small areas in a multi-residential building that they add an additional unit that goes beyond the density that they're allowed for the zone. Next slide. So what are the benefits of adding an ADU or JADU to your property? So with JADU, I mentioned the density. That's the same with ADUs. The state ADU is, square footage. There are, I have a property in Del Mar where they're limited to 1,200 square feet. And so they're already beyond, and that includes the garage. So they're already way beyond what they can build by right, but then we can jump in and add an ADU. The nice thing about Del Mar is that at least with that specific area, you can go above 800 and it would still be exempt. But in City of LA, that's not the case. It would be the state ADU is exempt from floor area, but if you're going beyond that, you can't add more. So that's an important thing to note with the local jurisdiction that you're in, to check on that and see, is it just the state ADU that's exempt, or are they exempting any ADU? Because that would be a really beneficial in some areas. City of LA, 800 up to 800. Beyond that, you need to look at the RFA and floor area ratio. So that's the advantage of the state ADUs, the square footage increase. You're able to add a dwelling unit without a planning entitlement case. Areas with overlays, Mulholland specific plan, for instance, the state ADU would be an administrative process. It would not have to go through a public hearing process. And the second kitchen. So if you've had developments in the city of LA, if you're a single family residential area, for instance, you can't have a second kitchen within the building. And in order to do that, and how we've gotten that approved in the past, is a variance process, which costs over $10,000 in just in the city fees alone, and the time, and you have a 500-foot radius notification for your neighbors. And so you have input, and the likelihood of getting approved, it's not guaranteed. So now with the ADUs, if a client comes, wants a second kitchen, that's a much easier process and much more guaranteed process to get that kitchen by doing the ADU and just ensuring that you comply with those ADU parameters. Other benefits are parking. That's a really big benefit. You can convert your garage, if it's a permitted garage, to an ADU. If you're within half a mile of a bus stop, you don't need to replace that parking. I'll talk more about coastal zone later. That's not the case in the coastal zone. But outside the coastal zone, you would be allowed to have that exemption from parking. And you wouldn't need to add additional parking for adding another dwelling unit if you're within a half mile of a transit stop. Important to note, ADUs are allowed in zones that allow residential uses. So single family, multifamily. If you go on the zone use list and you review that, if if it says residential use allowed, then the ADU would be allowed. Again, not coastal zone we'll talk about later, because that can vary in that area. Other benefit is Chris, last item is no public hearing. So, you're in a specific plan overlay area. The process would be administrative for review and no public hearing. That's not the case in the coastal zone. That still requires a coastal development permit. And if you're in a historic district and your site is a contributor to a historic district, you have a landmark on your property, then a public hearing may be required. So that's not always the case that you don't need a public hearing. So it's important to look at the specific property and if it's designated as a historic site or a potential contributor. Okay, now I'm ready. Next slide. Thank you. So criteria for qualifying for an ADU, I kind of jumped ahead, I guess, on that one, is residential zones. You can look at the use list. Am I allowed to have a residential use here? Then I can add an ADU. Some site conditions to look into or consider: if you're in a hillside area, to add an ADU, you are required to provide a 20-foot paved street along the front of the property. This is in the hillside community plan areas, except for Northeast LA and Eagle Rock, Silver Lake. Those are exempt from that. So if you're in Northeast LA, Eagle Rock, and you don't have the 20-foot paved, you don't need to worry about that. But outside of that, in the hillside areas, you will be required to provide a 20-foot paved street frontage in order to have the ADU. Very high fire severity zone. That is limits, you're required to provide sprinklers if it's a detached accessory dwelling unit, even if the dwelling itself doesn't require sprinklers or doesn't have sprinklers. You would still need to provide fire sprinklers for this new ADU that's detached. If it's attached to the main dwelling, you could be exempt from that requirement. So if you have a new ADU attached to the house in a very high fire severity zone, you would need to comply with the material requirements for very high fire, but you could be exempt from providing fire sprinklers. But if it's detached, very high fire, you will definitely require sprinklers. Other limitations, so overlay zones, those require, you're required to at least go through an administrative review process, and that they will specify the types of materials that you are allowed to use, and we'd not want to look at the specific plan for that area to know those types of regulations and go through the administrative process with the planner. In a historic zone, I will go into that in the more in the next slide, but again, if your site is a historic district, want to do the research to determine what the designation is for that project site, and that will vary the qualification for the ADU. You still have an accessory dwelling unit, but there will be a process that you have to go through with the potentially the Landmarks Commission, or just administrative through the staff on the types of windows and materials that you can use. And the other limitation is the coastal zone, which I'll get into in a future slide. Next slide, Chris. Thank you. So historic district, you will need a certificate of appropriateness to identify the materials that you're using to construct the ADU, that it complements the historic integrity of the property. It doesn't conflict with the historic nature of the home. And if if you have a landmark on site, the site is a contributor to a historic district, then a public hearing will be required. Otherwise, then it would be an administrative review process. If you've had experience with the city in the past, historic district, there is a lead time to that. An administrative process can be maybe a month or so, or it could go to several months depending on the backlog in that specific historic group. So that's something that's worth noting to a client if they're in that area, that it may not be a swift process to get this approved, and there may be scrutiny on the types of materials. We may not be able to just use a standard plan in that type of area. Design review boards. If it's a state mandated ADU that less than 800 square feet, then that would be an administrative review process. Again, you know, there's certain areas like Mulholland specific plan where there's a backlog with the city planning department. And so even obtaining an administrative process may not be a swift process. Anything beyond that 800 square foot will be a full design review. You will need a site plan review and would have to go through a public hearing. So if it has a lead time of a year to get that approval letter, it's a year. So that's something really important to note, as sometimes the assumption is it's an ADU, we can get it approved swiftly. There are cases where that can happen, but there are specific areas where there's a lot more regulation and, like we said, resistance to implement these looser regulations. Next slide, please, Chris. So coastal zones, that one is a really important item because the Coastal Commission has authority that outweighs the state ADU laws. And a big example, I mean, I know we're focusing on City of LA, but Oxnard, for instance, Coastal Commission has still not implemented ADUs, and they will not allow ADUs in the coastal zone in the city of Oxnard, which is crazy. As we said, it was signed back in 2016, and they still have not caught up and allowed those. So but that city of Oxnard and city of Los Angeles, the Coastal Commission does allow for ADUs and JADUs. However, they can add additional restrictions. And one of their big items is they scrutinize the parking. So you could get an approval or go through the process and obtain all your clearances for the ADU, and everyone's happy and signing off, and you're still in the process of getting your coastal development permit, and you go to that phase and they say, oh, they allowed you to have no parking. We want 3 parking spaces on site, show where they are. And those parking spaces would have to comply with the city regulations for a parking space, the backup aisle, the size, and all of that. So the circulation. So we have to provide all those types of diagrams. So you want to make sure you have room on site to do this. So that's a really big item with the Coastal Commission, is to either consult with them in advance or just be wary that you might be required to provide 2 or 3 parking spaces and having those on site. They will not be required to be likely covered. They can likely be uncovered parking spaces, but you will still need to have room for them somewhere on site. And it would require a full coastal development permit and going through that process. And the Coastal Commission, another item is they don't consider an ADU to be equivalent to a house, to a single family house, for example. So let's say you have 2, like a duplex or 2 single families on a property, and you want to make one of them into an ADU, that would be considered a reduction in the type of housing you're providing. So they would not accept that. You would need to add an additional dwelling ADU in that instance. You can't say that dwelling unit is now an accessory dwelling unit. The idea is that the ADU is an accessory. It's not a main residence on its own. So these are just the important items to consider when looking into constructing an ADU. really considering the location that it's in and those specific parameters, and then how the city is implementing these ordinances. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dina. That was enlightening, and some of us probably already wish we've heard your presentation some months ago, going on with the projects. So that said, do we have any questions? You can either unmute yourself, show your beautiful face and ask question, or you can put it into the chat.
Oh, I have a question. This is Laurel Shepherd. For the ADUs, I have heard, I've read in my own research that it doesn't apply to condominium associations. However, if you had a property that could be conducive to a JADU, do you know if there's any legal protections or rights that you can go to the homeowners association with to advocate for that?
Thinking about it, give me a second.
I'm going to help Dina with questions, and I'm going to, as Dina's thinking if she's got a deeper answer, Laurel, I'm going to say the state ADU laws do allow for ADUs to be added to multifamily residential buildings and properties. Now, I don't, and we've in fact helped people with apartments add ADUs, both as detached if they had extra space on their property, and also in converting non-residential but permitted space in that multifamily building into ADUs. I don't know, I'm not an ADU lawyer or HOA lawyer, if in what way the ADU rules outweigh a condominium association's HOA rules. So I feel like I've got you about halfway there, but I can't get you to
I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate that. And I do remember researching about multifamily units, but yeah, condominium associations are a little bit different. I wasn't expecting an answer. I just was maybe hoping for one, but thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we haven't had to go up against a condo. I mean, help with the condo association.
Right, and my instinct is to say that that could be a civil matter. So the city, you know, a building plan checker is not going to look at your CC&Rs. They're not going to look at what your HOA is restricting in the city of LA. They're going to go based off of the code and what the code allows. So for instance, state ADU, they're going to allow that. Can your association then sue and say, per our CC&Rs, you can't have this? You know, we've written it in there. I would say yes, but I'm not certain how that would go in court. I know that the city would tell you it's a civil matter and we're not involved in it.
That makes sense. Thank you, because you're right. HOAs are not going to have this written in there because this is all brand new for the most part.
Right.
Thank you. I'm in Santa Monica too, just so it makes it a little more complicated. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen has a question. Ellen, can you ask?
Yes. So I'm a little confused on the FAR. You said for the state, even if you've maxed your FAR, you get 800 square feet, up to 800 for an ADU. How about the city of LA?
So yes, in the city of LA, if it's a state ADU, so up to 800 square feet and meets those height limits, then you could exempt it from floor area. So let's say you have, you know, existing non-conforming, you're already over on floor area, you can still have that state ADU up to 800 square feet. But once you go above that, so there's the city ADU, which is up to 1,200 square feet. That one, so once we get over 800, the whole thing counts towards your floor area.
Okay. Attached or detached?
No, it doesn't make a difference if it's attached or detached, as long as it's that 800 square foot.
Okay, and is
I think we lost Ellen, we lost you. So we're, until we gain the connection, we're going to go to another question. Can an ADU be
If it's the garage, is the garage?
Ellen,
Since you
sorry,
said maybe
you-
adding on to it or something.
Yeah. Ellen, sorry, you broke, we lost you.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I was asking about the garage. If it's a garage, an attached garage conversion, then the garage now counts towards the FAR, right?
If it's under 800 square feet, then no, it would not count towards your floor area.
Okay, and that's in LA, anywhere except for the hillsides or.
Permitted. Yeah, as long as it's a permitted garage.
Okay, and I had a client about 2 years ago who wanted to do, they're in the Mount Olympus area where homeowners, and they said, you know, fire and hillside, they couldn't do it, but you're now saying hillside, they may be able to do it?
It's in the very high fire zone.
I don't know if they have a higher zone, but I know they have a 20-foot wide street. You know, it's very developed.
So sorry, you said it's in Mount Olympus and they wouldn't allow the ADU for what
Because
purpose?
for hillside, originally the city of LA restricted hillside areas. Are you saying that that has gone away now?
Yeah, I think I could, because of the history, I'll do this one, Dina, because you were on the city side when the very first ADU rules came out in 2017, I think it was.
Yeah.
The city actually was actively fighting the state laws. So there was a brief time where the city was saying, nope, can't have it anywhere except basically Reseda. But that has changed. That changed within about the first year, so roughly by 2018. So, so to answer your question, your client in Mount Olympus has 20 feet paved in front of their house, then they are allowed by state law to have an ADU up to 800 square feet, and the city can't stop them.
Okay, and if their insurance.
Sorry, Ellen, I am so sorry to break. I know that you want to ask questions, but we have so many other people asking questions. So when we come back, when we go through others, I apologize.
No.
Thank you. How many ADUs are allowed to be built for a duplex property? And we're going to just ask one question and then circle back so everybody has a chance to ask one question.
Magdalena, I am trying to answer the questions in the chat box. So if you want to take other hands, I'm happy. But however you want to do this, but I am trying to. So
if that, I am going to add to that question. How many ADUs are allowed? How many ADUs and JDUs? And if there is a, I'm going to add to it, is there a means you can circumvent and add more with maybe some SB? Or, just if somebody could answer that, that would be great. So can you?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dina.
Okay, you're allowed one ADU and one JADU if you're within a single family zone. If you're have an existing multifamily building, then you can have potentially up to 2 ADUs.
Detached.
Detached ADUs.
Yeah, remember that there is the little there is the way to, if you've got, you can do an attached ADU, as I mentioned a minute ago to Laurel, in an existing multifamily structure that has permitted, and that's a key word, permitted space that's non-residential. For example, a garage or a mechanical room or a rec room. Those spaces can be converted into ADUs as well, but only up to 25% of however many units the existing multifamily building already has. So a 16-unit apartment building, in theory, could find space for 4 ADUs within the building if they don't mind converting, all of those different spaces. So we were working with a client, and we're up to 4 ADUs, doing both the 2 detached that Dina mentioned, and also finding space within the existing building.
Thank you. Can an ADU be a second floor to an existing single floor home?
Yes. as long as it has its access. So then you would have it to have an exterior stair or something of that nature, and then the floor between the top floor, so the ADU on the top floor and the house would then have the 1 hour separation. So it's considered its own dwelling and would have its entrance and exit separate from the house, but you can put it on the second story.
Thank you. What is the average cost of per square foot of an ADU in Los Angeles? As an architect, we have couple of ADUs. I can tell you it's similar or more. If you have any single family in Los Angeles, that's just your best bet. So there is a wide range of prices, but if you know what the single family home, maybe even add to it, it's more than people think in general.
I'm really glad you answered that, because I was about to say that as consultants, Dina and I turn to our architects and we will provide permitting fees and we'll let you know what the city costs are going to be. But yeah, we rely, we can only give a partial answer because we don't take our clients all the way through construction and CFO.
We have a question from John Feldman, and then Mehdad will ask question. John.
Thanks, Magdalena. So Dina, you mentioned a 16-foot height limit on the 800 square foot detached. Is that from native grade? Or if we're on a a property that has topographical interest, some differentiation, can we stick a first floor in there at 400 and have a second above it? So the second really is on par with the building existing like first floor building pad, and the second is built in like a bunker underneath it with a total including floor height and ceiling on the second level that's going to exceed 16 feet. Would we get away with that?
Are you within half a mile of a bus stop?
Good question. This is in Thousand Oaks.
Oh, different city.
Or, and Magdalena, don't shut me down. If we had the bunker situation, could we have an accessory structure like barbecue and trellis situation above that enclosed ADU, and that would be kosher?
So I think, and I'm going to kind of help cover Thousand Oaks too, John, and good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, you too.
The state just says this amount of feet, depending upon, as Dina very clearly explained and thoroughly explained. It actually was news to me when she went over this the slide a couple of days ago. The state doesn't say how to measure height. So you have to, so our assumption has always been we have to go back to the local building and safety department and ask them, are you guys going to count this as a plumb line height? Are you going to do the 5 foot out tallest point height? And exactly what? So my default answer to you and any question about height would be that the state doesn't say how to measure height. So you have to go to your local municipality to get that.
Okay, thank you.
And for, different cities, so City of LA, it's building and safety that you would go to for these questions, but outside of City of LA would be the city planning department. They'll define what the height is. Generally, they'll say it's the lowest grade or like the natural grade. That's where you would measure it. And that state law is, and that summary applies to all cities. And so if you're within half a mile, then you are allowed 18 feet. If you're going to allow accessory structures on top of the ADU, like Chris said, that would be a municipality item. So we want to review that with them. If you're in an area that requires like a site plan review or a design review, those exterior modifications would be under review. The basic state ADU, even if you have a flat roof, but once you start adding accessory uses to it, you add a patio, then that can go under a design review process, and you could have neighborhood input on that.
Thank you.
Mehtad, your question, please.
Hi. Regarding the set of requirements between the city and the state, I understand that there's a difference, and I understand each one enforces different things, and we just talked about the height. But could you clarify a little bit more about the state and the city, and where that kind of a, why does it come in, why there's a difference, and what overrides and how does that work? A little bit more information on that, please. Thank you.
So in the state law, they indicate that the city they cannot restrict construction to the point where it doesn't allow this scenario. So they say up to 800 square feet with these height limits and 4 feet setback. They say you can't restrict beyond that. Other items in the government code that are worthy of noting is especially the update. If there is violations on site, like for example, you have a code enforcement violation for an unpermitted carport or something like that on site, these new codes can't prevent you from getting this state ADU. So if you're coming in to apply for a permit for a 750 square foot ADU that meets the state criteria, and they say, oh no, you have XYZ violations on site that have nothing to do with the ADU. They're not even close to the location of where you want the ADU. The code says you can't get an ADU. I have rights to that per this government code. Once you go beyond that state ADU, the 800 square foot with the 16-foot high limit and so forth, then the city can say, no, you have to comply with these regulations. You have a floor area limit, and you would now have to consider, all these requirements. It indicates open space in that, so you can't say, I'm required to have open space if I want to add this state ADU that meets these limitations. But once you're over 800, then everything applies. You still have to go through the zoning code. The only thing is, you're allowed up to 1,200 square feet and 4 foot setbacks, which is much better than the zoning code requirements. Sometimes, like if you want to do another, let's say like another accessory building or another habitable accessory building on site, the side yard setback has to comply with that of the main house. So if your main house requires 10 foot or 12 feet side yard, then that's required. But the ADU, 4 foot side yard setback. So that's the benefit of that 1,200 square foot ADU, is now you don't have to have the massive side yard setback as you would have for the house, but you're still limited by the floor area. The state ADU is administrative process if you're in a historic and you're not a contributor, or you're in an overlay zone. It's all administrative under the state ADU. Once we go to the city ADU, which is anything above 800 going into 1,200, that then would require a full design review board, full landmark commission. It would go through the process like any other type of development you have. The benefit of it is that 4 foot setback, and you get to have a kitchen. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. A quick clarification. Am I to understand that the 50% rule of existing single family size limitation for ADU does not apply anymore in City of Los Angeles, for example?
That does apply for attached ADUs, yes. So it can't be more than 50% of the existing residents for an attached ADU.
What about detached?
Then it's just the 800 or 1,200. You can't-
Okay.
Yeah, the only way to get it bigger than 1200 is for it to be the attached ADU, or if you're converting an existing accessory structure like a garage, you are allowed to convert it entirely, or to Alicia R's question, partially into an ADU. And sometimes we have very large garages or other accessory structures that are bigger than 1200 square feet. So that's another way of getting more, a bigger ADU is if you have an existing accessory structure that's more than 1200 square feet, you are allowed to convert that to an ADU. And if you have a garage, by the way, and you only want to convert half of it, you are allowed to do that as well.
The key item, and Chris has stressed it before, is it needs to be a permitted and has a certificate of occupancy. We have a project where they had a second dwelling, and it had a permit and everything, but they never called for inspection and never got its CFO'd. And so, you know, they have to pretend like it's a new building at this point. So we want to make sure not just that it has a permit, that it has a certificate of occupancy. This has been inspected and was built according to the permit and inspection records.
Thank you very much. I do have a question. Would you please, from your vast experience, let us know about 3 to 4 worst pitfalls somebody who develops ADU can be befallen to?
Okay, so one was the coastal zone of not looking into whether you're allowed to even have this ADU there. So City of Oxnard, the client hired us after they already prepared plans, and the immediate conversation with the city is you're not allowed to have an ADU in the coastal zone in Oxnard. And no matter how much debate and discussion we have with the staff or the coastal commission, and this is state law and it allows, that conversation couldn't go anywhere, because this is how the coastal commission in Oxnard is applying it right now. They're not allowing them. So that's a huge item. Another one is, again, looking into the location that you're in, the historic district. That is a significant item. If your project site is considered a contributor, if the landscaping as part of your property is considered a contributor, and where you decided to design the ADU and place the ADU may not get approved by the Landmarks Commission, or you have neighbors that will show up to those hearings and oppose the location and the structure, that's a big item to consider. So number one is, where am I located? Am I in a coastal zone, an area with a design review board, historic district, and establishing those conversations with those regulatory agencies to make sure you understand what your requirements are going to be. The parking. Yes, it's a great break on parking, but the coastal zone could come back and tell us that, we need to have parking and you have to provide the backup aisle and all that. And you may not have room on your property for something like that. Those are the big items that come to mind. Chris, do you have any additional?
Those are great. I would add a nuance to the coastal, and just, it is shocking to people to discover that they have to get a full CDP for either an ADU or a JADU. So if you are in the city of Los Angeles, so if you are in the city of Los Angeles, so your client is in Venice or Pacific Palisades, and they're like, it should be easy, it's right here. And no, you still have to do a full CDP. We cannot get you a coastal exemption or a CADX. You're going to need the full CDP. So it goes from an approval process of a couple of months to currently 12 to 15 months, and the cost goes way up, and there's public hearing involved, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I would add that everything that Dina said about the coastal zone is 100% true, and is a big flag. But really the difference, the drop off from an ADU in Palms versus an ADU in Venice, just a few blocks away, is significant in terms of time and cost. And then I do think, Magdalena asked us a really good question, and we talked a little bit about the garage thing, and Dina did. I'm so proud because I so often say, is it a permitted structure? It can't just be a structure that you see there. That has definitely been on multiple occasions. Dina talked about one of her projects, but me overseeing, the other staff here, we've had multiple projects where what everybody thought was a perfectly fine and permitted garage wasn't. And so then you have to start over and retroactively permit the garage, and then you can get going on your ADU. So a conversion. So I would say that that those are the biggest issues. And then my last one, Dina mentioned it at the beginning, and this is important for the architects and the designers on this call. Your clients are, if you haven't already experienced this, they're going to think it's accessory, it's small, it's easy, it'll be faster and cheaper. That's the other big red flag. It's not faster. It's barely cheaper, if at all. It's cool. You get to have another dwelling unit, potentially rental income, or a place for, a granny flat or adult children to live. But your clients, you should let them know that the city, as Dina so eloquently put it, the city takes new dwelling units very seriously, and they want to make sure that it is safe to, as safe as possible, as current standards. And so there is no shortcutting an ADU in the permitting and the timeline, because the city takes these very seriously.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dina, for the explanation. I see Serena has hand up. Serena, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I just had one quick other question. I know you talked about if the garage itself isn't permitted, but what happens if somebody wants an ADU and they have a bunch of other things on the property that have not been permitted, and the city comes on and they start seeing like all these other things that aren't permitted? Do they usually make them figure all that out before they can even get the ADU permitted?
So that's the nice thing. Thank you, Serena, for that question. The nice thing about the new updates. So the new effective January 1st, 2023 Assembly bill and Senate bill have now allowed it so you have development rights and you're not going to be penalized. So generally, yes, if you're doing development on a property, you do an addition, the inspector's on site. If he sees whatever, he's going to cite you and issue an order to comply. But the new state law is supposed to protect you from that. It says as long as this ADU or JADU has nothing to do with the violation, so the violations are over on the other side of the property, they're not related to that, you would still be allowed to apply and build an ADU without having to resolve all those code enforcement violations. Them being on site, they could, see these things and make note of them and issue an order in the future, but they can't prevent you from getting a C of O on that ADU.
Thank you for the explanation. Doral has another question, please.
Okay, I have so many questions, but I'll just do one at a time. So this is kind of a two-part question, but I'm in Santa Monica, and we heard that, or I read that there's a rush through the review process, like a 45-day stamp if you meet certain criteria with your submission. Have you guys already talked about that, or is that something unique to Santa Monica, or is that just
cities are not enforcing that? I don't know if you've have a recent permitting experience in the city of Santa Monica. It is a bit of a mess this year, especially since they updated their project docs permitting program this year.
okay?
has been, yeah, there's no quick turnaround. I would be very wary, and especially, warning your clients in the city of Santa Monica about the website. And it says, some things that says same day turnaround and all that. That is all fiction.
Okay.
That does not happen at all. There's no same day, any of that. And the process over there, regardless ADU or not, you have to, you submit through that system initially. It has to go through a supervisor, even if it's something that should be an express permit, like in the city of LA, or something you could get over the counter in one day. That does not happen in the city of Santa Monica. You need a permit specialist supervisor to assign it to a permit specialist, and that person's not at the counter or anywhere to be found. Then the permit specialist can then advance it to assign it to supervisors for all the different agencies, building, whatever. Then those supervisors assign it to the plan checkers.
Oh my
So
God.
that beginning process is already, you're looking at, could be a few weeks, depending on who's out sick and all that. So the state is not enforcing the turnaround, and unfortunately the city of Santa Monica makes a lot of promises that they can't deliver on when it comes to those timelines, to be frank. And the staff and the management are aware of that. I know that they have goals to achieve these items, of course, but because of the process and how they go through things, that's not the case. So the ADU turnaround is equivalent to that of a single family residence. It still has to go through all those steps that I described.
Okay. So that was like part one. Thank you so much for that. Sidebar is I used to be married to a LAFD battalion chief, and all of a sudden everything, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but all of the permits were approved very quickly, very, very quickly. Not so much anymore. The second one is, I know that this Governor Newsom, anyway, you know who I'm talking about. He did an emergency order for housing. Are these rules are they going to expire at a certain point in time?
No. So we were worried initially when they started adding all these ADUs. It was like, oh, apply now, especially if you're trying to legalize something that's already been there. It's like, apply now, because we don't know what's going to happen, especially because there's so much pushback from the cities on development. But the good news is, well, I guess it's not a good news if the housing crisis is still existing, but because of that, they're still loosening the regulations. So that's why now, the new laws allow for additional height, and they don't penalize you if you have non-conforming conditions on site.
Okay, I thought I'd read somewhere where they go away in 2025, but again, things have changed so much, I can't remember. So thank you.
Not the ADU rules. There could be some of the other, because there's been, a half dozen housing bills out of Sacramento for each year for the last several. So there could be others, but not the ADU rules. The ADU rules have no time, sunset time on them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for great presentation, great questions. Our wonderful time together talking and presenting about ADU is slowly coming to an end. So we're going to give a final chance to Dina and Chris for final remarks on ADU.
So like we said, make sure, if you're trying to convert a garage or, you have a guest house that you're trying to convert, make sure it has a permit and a certificate of occupancy. If, let's say, it's too old for a certificate of occupancy, I would just confirm with the building department. If it's, the building department, building and safety would be across the board for the permits. You want to confirm with them that they're going to accept that permit for the conversion, and you're not going to have to treat it as a brand new building. Looking into where the project site is located, if you have any specific plan, overlay zone, those items. If you're in a hillside area, making sure that you have a 20-foot front street frontage in front of the property line, along the property line, unless you're in the Northeast LA. And what was the other one, Chris?
The Silver Lake, Echo Park, Eagle Rock area.
So those are, you don't need the 20-foot street, but if you're in a hillside area that's not in those community plan areas, you want to make sure you have that. So you might need to get a hillside referral form from Bureau of Engineering. And then just setting the expectations for your client appropriately for, this is not going to be necessarily a faster, cheaper process. It could cost just as much as a brand new single family dwelling. There's great benefit to an ADU, if you want a second kitchen, if you want a second dwelling on site, a rental income, if, JADU or even ADU for, having relatives or, someone live with you, that's a great option to have an additional dwelling that has its own cooking facilities and so forth. Legalizing, sometimes there's already a garage that's been converted to a dwelling a long time ago. It's a good idea to get that permitted and you make sure that it's safe for the occupants to avoid any future safety or litigation issues with having an illegally converted garage. So there's great benefit to the ADU, JADU. They've loosened regulations, reduction in parking, and so forth. But setting expectations and knowing the parameters of the specific site are key. Those are my final remarks. I don't know if Chris, you had any additional items to add.
Well, if I'm allowed, then yes, I would say the only thing I'm going to say actually is, so do you guys all understand why when I found out that Dina, who was the chief engineer for the building and safety department, was available? She was a free agent. I'm like, come work for Pacific Crest, help our clients, help our architects. That's all I'm going to say is Dina's fantastic. I learned things from tonight and working with her in the last couple of weeks. And yeah, if anybody has any questions about ADUs, Penny set the tone many years ago. We like to talk to our architects. We like to answer questions. Of course, we would like to help you and your clients actually, under contract doing permitting, because that's what we do. But we like our architects so much that we talk to you guys all the time, and we're happy to answer more questions. So if you guys have other questions, please reach out to us. As Magdalena mentioned at the beginning, we are not only sponsors of AWA+D, but we are members. And there are other members from PCC on this call. Cora Johnson, by the way, joined us in the middle of this. Also another former building and safety executive who's now a PCC consultant. Yeah, if you have further questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We love working with our architects the best, and we'd be happy to. And you get to work with cool people like Dina. So there you go.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody, for attending. Just the final remark, do check our website, Association of Women in Architecture and Design. For those who are not members, we have some great tours and presentations coming up. And heads up, sometime in the next month and a half, we will have part 2 to this presentation. We will have members of our organization showing off with their own ADU designs, landscape designs, interiors of the ADUs, either finished or in progress. So stay tuned and have a good night and wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.